Mr. Bagley.
Mr. Shively.
How are you doing this week?
Very well, thanks. How about yourself?
I'm doing fine, thanks. Well, let's just jump right in here. And, one of the things that we've talked about over the course of years, months, for a while now is, one of the differences between how we approach things is very different, I think, especially when it comes to the idea of conspiracies, right? And some people might even call them conspiracy theories. And so I thought maybe we'd dig into that a little bit this week and talk about what we mean by conspiracies and maybe try to figure out if we can kind of find some more common ground when it comes to how we think about reality and how we think about the way the world is and how it all functions and how it all holds together. What do you think?
Sounds like a plan.
So, as we like to do, is we want to make sure that we're talking about the same thing, right? That we're talking about using the same definitions for words like conspiracy. So, let's talk a little bit about that, and as far as what we mean when we say a conspiracy. Now, you and I had talked about this ahead of time, and we had kind of come up with a definition for what a conspiracy is, or what we think a conspiracy should be considered. I'm just going to bring that up here. What we kind of settled on was a definition that a conspiracy has several characteristics, right? That it needs to have in order to be called a conspiracy. And when I say conspiracy, I'm talking about a real conspiracy, something that actually is not just a theory, but is a real conspiracy. And so what we came up with was a conspiracy is a secret effort to create overt acts towards a specific goal by an organized group, right? And it has to be secret, right? It has to be something that is covert and not showing its intentions, right? But it also has to be an organized effort, right? It can't just be things happen to turn out a certain way loosely based on just people doing whatever it is that they do from day to day.
Right. And I think it's important to reiterate something that you just said in there that, may not be picked up on, but I think it's important to point out conspiracies exist.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think we can agree on that.
Yeah. I mean, that's not to say that everything everybody points at, that's the difference between conspiracy and conspiracy theory to some extent. But you have to operate from the perspective that conspiracies do exist, so you can't automatically dismiss anything that seems to fit the framework as a conspiracy theory and then to be ignored.
Right. In fact, I think you even mentioned the fact that when people add the word theory to it, very often it's very specifically, a pejorative use of the term. Right. It's tried to. It's basically just means to throw the whole thing out by just calling it a theory as opposed to an actual conspiracy.
Yeah, it's kind of used as a rhetorical device to put that as something that then you can remove from consideration without looking at it any more deeply or thinking about it at all as like a thought terminating cliche.
Right. Because I mean, we don't really, and we don't really have a term for uh, a conspiracy that isn't a conspiracy, right? I mean, it's that basically a negative term. So I think maybe people tend to use the term conspiracy theory as that, right? As a way to debunk it or to basically throw the baby out with the bathwater, as it were.
Right.
So then, how is it then that we have come to such different ways of looking at things when it comes down to what is and what isn't a conspiracy? How do we dig into that? How do we try to figure out whether or not the conspiracy is actually conspiracy or not?
I have thought. Um, so we had spoken last time and we've, referenced this numerous times. You had performed an experiment recently where you had put into an AI, um, you'd given it an exercise to um, kind of do what we're doing, evaluate an argument from both political sides and kind of try to make sense of that. And it had generated something that we both found interesting. Um, the idea that the one of the reasons for the disconnect there was that what both people thought were shared assumptions were not. So one of the notes that I had made, I wanted to actually we had talked about this, but I want to identify the pattern that it identified in each of the examples that it gave. So it said number one, surface disagreement seems to be about policy specifics. Number two, deep disagreement is about foundational assumptions, which is what we're going for. Three, neither side recognizes their common ground isn't shared. So the assumption by both sides that they're talking about the same thing. Both think the other is being illogical or immoral because if you were operating from that assumption, it's obvious that this follows. Um, and five, which is the kind of the conclusion there. Actually, they're working from incompatible frameworks. So, in thinking about that, I I realized in talking about this, I wholeheartedly agree with the description of conspiracy, the definition of conspiracy that we've come up with. Um, what I have the idea that came to me while I was thinking about this is that I think my initial hypothesis here is that a lot of the times when we do this, we're operating from a difference in directionality. So in this instance, what I would say is that we could identify that as conspiracy, but I think the disconnect is I'm not looking at it as a conspiracy. I'm not looking at, I when I do analysis on this, it's kind of in the different order. What I'm getting out of the conspiracy definition is that it kind of starts with people are doing it. So people are doing this, they're doing it for a real reason. They're trying to accomplish something, which was they're trying to accomplish what we feel like we've observed happen. Um, and obviously we didn't know about it beforehand, so it has to be secret. So kind of what I'm starting with is kind of working in the other direction. Like, is there a pattern? Is there something to be observed? If there is a pattern, why? What happened? What does that accomplish? Where does it come from? Were there people involved? And does it appear to be, uh, something that somebody was trying to do? I mean, we've got this idea. I think it's widely accepted on social media that for people who are like us, to some extent, siloed to some extent in a particular political side, that we are fed on social media things that correspond to the ideas that we already have and amplify the crazy on the other side. Where, when we get something from the other side, it tends to be kind of the most extreme thing. Now, you can look at that and you can say, you know, um, the guys at the head of the social media things, they're meeting in this back office in San Francisco with their cigars and they're, plotting to. But I think we know at this point that this is actually just the algorithm feeding engagement that, people stay on the site longer, comment more, like more, and that type of thing when they're fed that type of thing. So I mean, it's not a conspiracy, but it is something that's happened.
So, I mean, I think what I hear you saying is that it's it's a group type of phenomenon. Is that what you're
Yeah.
saying?
Yeah. I mean, it's something that we observe that, you know, people are being fed particular types of information, but it's working up from, okay, we noticed that. Why is that happening? As opposed to kind of looking at it more from top down, where it's like, you know, who's doing this? Hey, that may be the key. What's happening versus who's doing.
Right, because like we said in the definition, I mean, it does have to be an organized group, right? It is. I mean, it's not just a person here or there doing something that may or may not, play out a certain way, right? I mean, this is an effort. This is a concerted effort by some block or some group, usually elite, right? It kind of, it implies some kind of eliteness, right? Of that group, being a smaller subset that is controlling, um, the way things go and the way things are play out. Is that a fair
Right.
way of saying it?
Yeah. Yeah. And I felt like, because like we talked about before, the word elite carries a lot of baggage and a lot of connotation. So I felt like for us to begin discussing that, what we may want to start with is a very simple definition of just kind of the people who have the ability to influence things. You
Right.
know,
So, for example, there is certainly on the right, there's an idea of an elite media, right, that is controlling a certain narrative. Um, and that narrative, from one perspective is perhaps exclusive or exclusionary, right, of certain people or certain ideas. Um, and that, I mean, that's a big one, right? That I think between the right and the left. That there's some kind of media cabal, right, that is controlling the narrative towards a certain direction, basically,
right.
as an
And
example.
so, and again, looking at that kind of in the opposite direction, um, it's like I would start with, is there evidence that things tend to group a certain way where you're getting the same perspective routinely from the same source? Which, if you start with that, and I mean, take that aside from party, that's obvious to everybody. I mean, you tune in MSNBC because you want a left leaning narrative. You tune in Fox News because you want a right leaning narrative. Um, Pretty much nowadays, you don't turn in CNN at all. But, um, I mean, if you look at it starting there, that seems blatantly obvious to everybody, which is why the left has the faux news narrative and all of that. Because I mean, to some extent, you know what you're going to get. Um, then you take that up the next step. Um, are people doing that? And I mean, yeah, to some extent, you believe that's grouped and coordinated because it's happening that way. But is it because the people at the top are intended to do that, or is it because the people that are there share a perspective, and so they just kind of orient everything in that direction? Um, and I mean, there's an argument to be made in both ways, and as with most subjects, it's going to be like a combination of things. Um, but I mean, that doesn't necessarily get to the point of saying that, there's this little group in the back office of the White House that nobody knows about that's dictating all media strategy.
Right, right. So, how do we then approach a way to look at a situation, any situation, like, whether it's voter fraud or whether it's, I don't want, I mean, obviously there are certain things, certain conspiracy theories out there that we both can probably agree are crazy, right? I mean, we've talked, like, for example, the flat earth theory, right? For example, I mean, I don't think either one of us subscribe to that as a, a uh, true thing, that we're being fed some, it's a conspiracy to tell us that the earth is round, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, we've seen enough evidence to have accepted that argument at this point. But I think if we were, and I don't think either one of us actually prepared to do this today, but if we were going to actually explore that argument, and take it seriously in order to disprove it, first thing that we'd have to do is examine the evidence of the people who are advancing that idea. Because, this is another thing that gets done in this space is that people have come to a conclusion, so they look at the other side and they're just like, "Well, that's stupid." You know? It's how the hell do you believe that?
Right,
Uh,
exactly. Yep, exactly.
you know, and and with almost everything, there's some kind of evidence behind that that builds an argument.
Well, that's the problem with conspiracy theories, right? I mean, if we're talking about, let's use this term, and I'm not using it pejoratively. I'm not using it to say that it's not true. I'm saying we're going to put forward a theory, right? That there is
Mhm.
this conspiracy, and then we're going to explore whether or not that is actually a conspiracy or if it's just a full of hot air, right? And just not true.
Yeah, in
Um,
in an in an ideal world, the term conspiracy theory would mean an idea that, a theory that we've identified something that's happened and we think that there may be people who are responsible for it.
do you think
And
that
that's
some
all
of
it would
us
be.
are just more likely to believe in conspiracies than others?
Well, again, this is where I go back to my idea on directionality. Because, when I'm looking, the analogy, the example that I came up with this is the idea in physics where, we looked at physics and there was one example from Einstein, I believe, where there was a gravitational impact on space-time that he theorized that in order to prove that they had to examine positions of stars and planets relative to a solar eclipse, which removed the sun. I'd have to look up the exact story. It was something I heard recently, but it was an idea that he postulated that until the exact conditions came up that they could, evaluate that.
Find a way to prove it, right?
Yeah, they had to look at that. The other idea that occurred to me that may be more readily available is the idea that we have at this point for dark matter. Now, no one has ever physically produced, as far as I know, a piece of dark matter to say, here's dark matter. Um, what we've done is we have this understanding of the universe. Um,
And there's this missing
and
part, right, that we can't
yeah,
seem to
we
explain.
we have these equations. Under these circumstances, the equations all line up. Under other circumstances, it's like,
There's
yeah,
something
there's
missing.
there's
There's a
something
missing
missing
part,
in there.
right. Yeah. And so in a sense, it becomes, I think if I see where you're going with this, in a sense, it becomes that missing link, that missing part that just kind of fills in all the details. And is are you suggesting that that's what we do when we're trying to apply something as a conspiracy? That we're trying to fill in that missing part?
Well, what
Is that where you're
I'm
going with this?
saying is that when I look at these things that frequently tend to be identified as conspiracies, that's kind of where I'm operating from. And then when somebody comes in and calls it a conspiracy theory, what they're doing from my perspective is they're basically coming in and said, "Well, God did that."
Or they're saying that you're a crackpot for believing that.
Yeah, that either that doesn't exist, what you're
Right,
observing is not happening,
right, right.
or there's a higher authority that's coming in and that's making that happen.
So when we disagree on something, whether or not something a conspiracy is real, right? And that usually happens in some type of political context or governmental context or something like that. Um, and it also tends to go back to kind of a group identity type of thing as well, does it not? I mean, it becomes a part of someone's identity when they believe something.
Yeah, that definitely happens. Um, and what we're part of that is going back to that initial framework that the AI gave us, where we're starting with different premises. So now there's no question, and this is I think one of the reasons why it gets confusing. There's no question that there's somebody on the internet that has taken that far, extreme position of, it was the lizard people that did this.
Right, exactly.
And and that goes back to, kind of the algorithm thing. It's like if we're not getting the full perspective from the other argument, all we're being fed is that extreme example.
Right. So, for example, um, one general type of belief from the left and the right, I think we could probably agree that um, the result of whatever power structure is going on is that some people are making out much better than most of the rest of us, right? I think that's a general. I think there's a general agreement that things are getting really, really good for a handful of people and not so great for everybody else, right?
So
Um,
that would
but then,
in
but
my
then
end.
we have different ideas of who is behind that, right? And different ideas of why that's happening. Because I think from the left, we tend to look at these things and we say, if there's a conspiracy, then it's probably these really rich capitalist, billionaires that are pulling all the strings behind the scenes. Whereas on the right, you're saying, well, there's this huge cabal of unelected bureaucrats that are actually pulling all the levers and strings um and so we're basically seeing something very similar, but basically ascribing different um, machinery behind what's actually happening. Is that a
Okay.
fair way of saying it?
Hold that thought.
Hmm.
I need to take a brief left turn to advance another idea, and then I want to come back and respond to that, by which time I'll have probably forgotten what it was we were talking about. So remember that because I want to go back to it. Um, so in thinking about this, there's another metaphor analogy that I came up with on how people look at these things. So it's the idea of you've got a map, and so that's reality basically. On that map, we lay layers. Imagine a layer of transparency that's got some specific feature on it. Like imagine a blank map of the outline of the United States. You've got a layer of transparency that gives you elevation change. You've got a layer of transparency that gives you uh, river tracks. You've got a layer of transparency that gives you state borders. Anybody who's looked at a weather app, you can do this with the weather where it'll give you, temperatures
Layer
and
the different.
Doppler
Yep.
and everything like that. So what I think happens, one of the things that happens is that we're looking at all of this, and I know I'm analytical. I'm analyzing everything. So as I'm looking at it, I'm adding layers and adding layers. And so by the time it gets to the point where, I see you post on Facebook on something, I've got this map built that's like 8 layers deep. So when I give you my conclusion, I'm not showing the work. So, so I think that one of the things that happens in these, and I realize that a lot as I'm even trying to make posts because it's like there is a string of equations here that I've strung together to come up with this perspective that you have to understand all of these things in order to have any idea of um, what I'm even saying.
Right. So what you're
And
saying is that you got to deconstruct it first in terms of
right,
the other person's perspective, and deconstruct it first before you can really understand how they got to where they got to.
right. So what we should be doing is we should be examining each layer, and each transparency is going to be a different level of this discussion on the topic. And what if we as individuals were trying to collaborate, which is what you and I are trying to do, in order to evaluate information to determine what's accurate, what's true, um, we would be comparing notes because sometimes you're going to decide that the transparency that you're using doesn't fit the map. Um, and that may be that you're using the wrong transparency. That may be that you're looking at the wrong map. It's a difference in perspective at that point. It may be that some of them don't fit together. Um, and that may be getting a little abstract. But that was one of the things that I thought about, because a lot of this. Um, so hopefully you've remembered what it was that I was
Yeah,
supposed
and
to
so
respond
so
to.
since just to kind of bring it back around to where I was going, those layers, to put a finer point on it, are different levels of assumption, right?
Right.
In
Yeah.
essence, I
So
mean, when we're talking about an issue, then each layer is an assumption that then provides another opportunity to layer another assumption on top of that. If this, then
right.
this, then this, then this, right? In
So
essence.
so when it comes to the topic of conspiracy, that top layer for me, like the last thing that I get to, or one of the later things that I get to, is did somebody do that? And then a layer after that is did somebody do this on purpose? And were there a bunch of people working together on purpose to make, those are all different layers.
Right. Right. And that's one of
So
the reasons why I brought up the idea of voter fraud, right? And elections and election security and election, because that's one of the areas where the right and the left definitely has very widely different perspectives on reality, on what is actually happening. Now, both of us can probably look at an election, and if the outcome is a surprise, right, is something that we didn't expect, then obviously that the first question is, well, then that's something that we should look into, right? To see whether or not it actually did go the way that it said it did, right? Um, but there's a whole bunch of assumptions that have to happen in order for us to get to the point where saying that there was a concerted effort to steal the election, right? And but you can't just jump right to that. You have to find all of the steps in between of all those assumptions, like you're saying, before you can get there.
so
And I'm not
I
saying that we should debate this specific issue and whether or not this specific issue is a conspiracy. I'm just using it as an example.
no, and I mean, we probably don't want to get too far into it because we could spend, a whole hour going on
Just talking
that.
about that. Exactly.
But I believe in going back to the AI example, um, my approach to this, and I have to say, I can only speak for myself. I do not represent the right or the Republican Party or, anything like that. But when I looked at that, you're talking about voter fraud. Well, the layer below that is was the election influenced? Because voter fraud is a transparency layer or two higher. That's physically manipulating the ballots that have been cast.
Or casting them illegally. Right.
Yeah,
Sure.
or casting them illegal. So is that the only way to influence the outcome of an election? Um, and this, I had been considering making the suggestion of looking at, because I'm feel like I'm kind of driving the beginning of this conversation as far as topics that we want to cover in each episode because I'm looking to kind of establish these different layers of things that we need to look at. So after conspiracy theory, I was kind of looking at maybe the next thing that we want to talk about is to examine in more depth the history of the CIA. Um, because the question, if we're going to talk about election manipulation, um, one of the things that we've got to look at is there any historical evidence that there have been groups that have tried to influence the outcome of elections?
And we know that there have been. I mean,
Lot.
there is hysterical evidence of around the world, right, in various times where elections have been influenced surreptitiously and dishonestly, right?
Right. And if we're looking at this, trying to find truth, the left operated for 4 years on the idea that Putin and the Russians manipulated the outcome of the 2016 election.
Right. Yep.
That was a widely accepted narrative. So, you know, you're missing a couple of layers of transparency to get to the point of um, the Dominion voting machines in Georgia were hacked.
Right. Exactly. So we could possibly go back and dig down through those layers, and we couldn't try to find if we were going to explore that particular topic, right, and just using it as as an example for how to approach any type of situation that is put forward as a theory of conspiracy,
Right.
right, and the first step would be to try to find out, well, what do we know, right, within reasonable bounds of the whole situation, the whole layout of like you said, the map, right? What can we
Yeah.
agree on is the base level, and we can say that there certainly are. We could take, for example, if we wanted to explore whether or not Putin specifically and his administration had efforts to help Trump get elected, right? We first would ask the question, for example, we might be able to agree on the idea that, or maybe not, I don't know, the idea that Putin would rather have Trump as president than Hillary Clinton, right? We'd have
I
to
mean, we
first ask ourselves, do we agree on that point? And if we don't, then we have to go back a step even before that, right?
yeah, but you're about four layers up off the map before we even get there. The first thing that you've got to look at is, were the results of the election not indicative of the will of the public? Was it
Right.
was it manipulated somehow? If it was manipulated, was Russia involved? If Russia was involved, did Russia prefer Trump or, Clinton? So that, I mean, it's that process that, I'm looking at. One of
But
the
then again, of course, every election is manipulated, right? To some extent, right? Because we can agree that a candidate is always going to say things that they think are going to manipulate people into voting for them,
right.
right? I mean, that's the idea of politics, right? In terms of elections and democratic politics, is to
Yeah,
be able to convince people to agree with your position
yeah,
and
the
support you.
candidate's gonna say stuff to influence your thinking. The people representing the candidate are going to say things. The media are going to say things.
Right. So perhaps that's the base level. Perhaps that's the base level of that particular type of topic, right? We can agree there. We can agree that the whole idea is is to manipulate at some level, right? I mean, like, manipulate votes. Now, in a good, proper democracy, right, that works, then it's all done based on the rules that we've all put forward and agree upon that we're going to play by these rules, right? We're going to
Right. I
say,
mean, everybody is accepting that there's going to be, on that base level, and without even thinking about it in those terms, we're accepting that there's a certain amount of manipulation involved in this process.
right, yeah. And the idea then is, okay, then can we agree that the rules were followed, right? That both sides were following the rules, and if not, where did they deviate from those rules? And then you have to add you can't do that if you agree on that somebody has stretched or broken rules in order to manipulate. Then you also have to ask, well, was it intentional? Right? Was it a concerted effort to break the rules, or was it inadvertent?
So
Um,
I think my next question on something like that would be looking at, you kind of try to like isolate the information that people use to make the decision. And then you look at, was that information accurate or was it inaccurate? And if it was inaccurate, did the people who gave you that information know that it was inaccurate and were using that to influence you? Or were they just reporting what they believed and were not
Believe was
aware that
true.
this was
Right.
incorrect?
Right. Right. Because it makes a big difference. Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's kind of my thing for that. I had come up with a couple of examples to look at for this too. And the idea of, like I said last time, one of the things that really started me down this road of really trying to look into things was everything going on with COVID. Um, so my process in a lot of this starts with me looking at things and something pops in my mind that says, okay, this looks weird. What's going on? This doesn't, something doesn't seem right. So, one of the things that I found interesting very early on in COVID was you had this idea of the lab leak theory. So this gets into conspiracy theory because I think one of the reasons that got shut down is you had a wide variety of what people were actually saying. There were a lot of people, and this is kind of my perspective. It's like, okay, we have established, and this is agreed upon, you know, most people had agreed on this by now. We've got this virus. We feel like it had originated in Wuhan, China. There's a level 4 biolab that studies coronaviruses in China. Do we think that might be connected? And this is, what Jon Stewart went on a couple of years later and said on Colbert. It was like, okay, duh. Um, but the reaction was, and there were people, which, again, the algorithm amplification, this may have been what people saw, but there were people who took that and went to China created this virus as a bioweapon to inflict it on the world.
Right. Which is a pretty big jump.
Right.
I'm not even saying it's not true. I'm just saying it is a big jump to jump directly to that.
Right. And then the other thing that really caught my attention is like, if you said COVID-19 may have some connection to the lab, you were eliminated from the internet. You were kicked off Facebook. There were people permanently kicked off Facebook. There were people permanently kicked off Twitter till Elon bought it. Um, there was a reaction to that on a scale that didn't appear warranted for what was being said.
Okay. All
And
right. I'm trying to.
what people would come back with, it's like if if you and I had had a conversation on the phone at that point, because it's the only way we could have done this. And I said, you said, well, what I've heard is that it came from this, market where they buy exotic meats and there was a bat sold there that somebody consumed. Okay, yeah, I mean, I know that diseases can transmit that way. That's a possibility. And I'd be like, but you know that there's
Well, we
those
know something
lab.
similar happened with HIV, right? By
Yeah.
now.
Well, I mean, that's a whole other conspiracy thing that we could get into too. Um, but you know, be like, okay, so there's this lab that's in that town that studies these things too. Um, do you think it might be connected to that? And we could have that conversation, but it seemed like what people were reacting to was like all they had heard was that the Chinese government created this Frankenstein virus to get us all.
Right. Right. I know. And, of course, the more serious the charges, right, the more extreme people's reaction is going to be to it also as well, right? I mean, I think that's probably partly what you're describing by people's knee jerk reactions to these theories being put forward, right? Because obviously this was, I mean, we know that there were people getting sick, right? We know that. We know that people died. We know, we mean, we can't not count all the bodies and the body bags and the morgues that were overrun, right? I
Yeah,
mean, we
that's
know those are real facts,
we.
right?
I mean,
Everybody
looking
knows
at the
somebody probably who died from it.
spectrum of conspiracy theories, and there were many. One of the ones that you can identify is COVID doesn't.
It's true. There were people that, but we know that something was killing people, right? We know that some people were dying. I mean, at least we can start from that point. Um,
Mhm.
and the problem comes, I think, and by the way, I think this is something we'll probably have to get back to at some point. The whole idea of COVID and the whole idea is that all the conspiracies, because there are so many conspiracies around COVID, and many of the divisions that we have today between, especially the Trump supporters and the non-Trump Trump haters, all kind of stemmed from those conspiracy theories around COVID, right? A lot of
Well,
them.
this is another thing, and again, going back to kind of my fundamental analysis, this is another thing that struck me as weird. Like, why is this breaking along political division line? And back to our definition of conspiracy, that lends a little more credibility to the idea that somebody is pushing things to want to make this happen.
Well, we also did have at the time a president who was trying to reassure everybody that it was not a big deal, right?
Right.
We do know what he said. We know we have the records of what he said publicly about it. It'll all be gone in no time, kind of thing. This is not a big deal. You shouldn't worry too much about it. Um, and of course, when you have political leaders saying a certain thing, that makes it a political issue, does it not?
It does. But again, the thing that strikes me as weird on that is okay, you had Trump saying it wasn't a big deal. I want to derail the argument. I think there was some validity to that point of view. Um, you have the community, medical community, everything reacting in a different direction, public health. Um, and then you have Trump being recruited on board with that to where, he does do lockdowns and does advocate things, so he gets more in line with that position. And he is also then in line with the position that what we need to get out of this is the vaccine. So Trump gets behind this Operation Warp Speed that we want to have the vaccine ready as quickly as possible. And the political response to that is I'm not putting anything in my body that Trump was involved. We could go back and find clips of everybody, at the top of the Democratic Party saying, I don't want any part of it. We have an election, we get a new president. Next thing you know, as soon as the vaccine comes out, everybody got to have it. So that's another thing where I look at, well, okay, so it wasn't about the vaccine. There's something else going on. That's that's the political division, and that indicates to me that there's another agenda. There's something else going.
Right. But I mean, that's so in order for a thing to rise to the level of conspiracy, right? Then
Hmm.
then there has to be something, some reasoning behind it, does there not? I mean, there has to be some purpose at
So
hand.
agreed. So let me define this because what I feel like looking at this, I feel like the fundamental disconnect between where I feel like you're coming from most of the time and where I'm coming from on this is that is it a conspiracy? Because we can agree on what a conspiracy is. What I feel like that we run into is that, like, I'm not saying that's a conspiracy. I feel like if we add enough layers on it, it could be a conspiracy. But right now, I'm just saying, that looks like something that happened that is not did not result in the way that I would have expected it to.
Right, but I mean, what you end up with is a huge number of people on one side of the political divide who has basically decided, for example, that Tony Fauci is a criminal, right? For example, right?
100%.
Yeah, and that then and you've got the other side going, well, where do you get that from? Where how do you get to that point, right?
So go back to my map analogy. That is the end conclusion of 15 layers of transparencies being laid on the map.
Okay,
So, in order to understand that, you have to go back through those 15 layers, because for that instance in this argument, if you look at COVID, part of that comes from was he, under the Obama administration, we had prohibited gain of function. So you have to look at was gain of function research occurring in the Wuhan lab, which it appears to be. If gain of function research was occurring, are we connected to that? Well, there's a case to be made for that. And the funding for that was coming through the position of Anthony Fauci, who, if he was advocating or promoting this kind of research, was circumventing the will of, the American government that didn't want that occurring. Then, if you lay on top of that, he goes and testifies before Congress and says, absolutely not. That was not gain of function research. We weren't doing. And then, so the argue, and I didn't prep for this, so I'd have to go back and pull out what exactly all of these details are for this narrative. But, the idea basically there is this is the guy who's responsible for the funding that created it. He's the guy put in charge of the response to it, and he's lying about the whole.
assuming that he's lying, right?
Right.
Right. I mean,
Well,
and so and you, I mean that, and people have fallen kind of on both sides of that, depending on where they fall in the political divide. Frankly,
and I mean that's another question in that those different layers that you look at. It's like, okay, d- you know, it was his department. Did he actually know that we were funding gain of function research? And if he knew it, did he do anything about it, or was he good with that? And so, at that point, if he knows that we're doing gain of function research that he knows was prohibited in this country, and he goes and testifies to Rand Paul that it wasn't gain of function research, then he's lying. But there's three or four other things that you have to assume in that. And then there's another layer of that I wasn't even aware of. Um, that's part of the story is that apparently, you know, as you had referenced a couple of minutes ago, the previous major health crisis that people of our generation had been through was the AIDS crisis. And I wasn't aware until this, I had heard about this last year, maybe, that he was a pivotal figure in the response to AIDS and advocated for a medical treatment. I believe it was called AZT, which was a failed chemotherapy drug that they dropped because it killed too many people. Um, so there's the argument for nefarious, um, or at least um, not particularly beneficial handling of that as well. So it
so
again,
but
that's
but again, this gets back to the heart of conspiracy, right? Because then again, you have to ask yourself, was that because of faulty knowledge and an honest mistake of trying something to try to help solve a very real health problem and health crisis, or is it something? Because I mean, I guess when we try to apply the definition that we agreed on at the beginning, you have to at some point get to the level of they're trying of what it is that they're trying to actually achieve. So, I mean, in this case, you would almost have to assume, would you not, that what they were trying to achieve was harming people at some level, right? I mean, that's the part where I think people start to roll their eyes and go, "Wait a minute here. Well, what is he really getting out of that? What is he getting? What is he? How is he benefiting from this?" Right? And
Yeah, and I mean that's a conclusion that you come to, and I think that's an example of what I was talking about, where you're putting the wrong transparency on the wrong map. Um, and that's what people get to is that there are people that are saying Anthony Fauci is trying to kill people, and I mean
I would have a hard time finding a reason to believe that myself
through a
personally.
string of logic you could get there, but I don't know that that's necessarily what I would look at that as is if a lot of these other layers that we're building up are accurate, um, my thinking would be that his incentive in what he was doing was something other than improving public health.
See, I mean, the way I look at it from this standpoint is I'm trying to find a way to get back to a point of basic a zero starting off point, basically, where because I feel like very often where we go right off the bat from these in any of these issues that when we try to put forward an idea that something is a conspiracy, um, in order there always has to be, and you mentioned this the other day about groups and how groups get defined not necessarily by their shared what they have in common, right? But what they are actually against, right? Or what people, there has to be some kind of an outside element of danger or against our best interests kind of group, and then that defines us as a group in reaction um to that danger, right?
Right.
So, in a sense, what you're really suggesting there is that we're starting off from a lack of trust in each other at some level.
Well, I mean, I think that there's no question that's where we are. That's part of why we wanted to do this is that we see that reflected in the society that we live in, and we kind of want to break that down and why are we that way, and is there anything that we can do about not being that way, because we also realize that we've got a lot in common and we don't really understand how we got that way.
Right, exactly. Because bottom line is that, when you look at the research that's been coming out in the last few years, it's overwhelming that people on one side or the other, and those who are most involved, I'm not talking about the normies, right? The people that are most involved in politics and in the discussion are the people who feel the most strongly that the other side is not only wrong, but dangerously wrong, right? I mean,
Yeah.
we've gotten to a point where um, it's beyond just disagreeing. It's become an existential threat at some
Well,
level.
I mean, going back to your Fauci example, it's it's not just that the people that we're disagreeing with were wrong. So in his example, that he took the wrong responses to things. It's that it was malicious, which is what you were saying with it's not just that he handled it badly, it's that he was intentionally trying to harm.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's where we are today, obviously, in a political sense. I mean, I guess the question then becomes, well, how do we unwrap those layers that you're talking about? how do we get back down to base level, right? To
So yeah, so I
the
feel
starting
like
line.
that, you know, circling back to kind of where I started today, we need to then hold in mind, and you may even want to link this in the notes or post it at some point, that outline that the AI gave us. The thing that we need to start with, and this was part of the conversation that we had leading up to doing this. We need to step back until we find where we do have common ground, and then we can evaluate every layer that gets built on that.
Right, right. So, like I said, get back to a baseline, right?
Right.
Right.
Yeah, that I mean, exactly. The first thing that we need to do is establish a baseline that we can work from.
And that would have to be even in the discussion of any issue that presents itself as a potential conspiracy, because we have to get back to the point of, okay, we know, like I said, when with the COVID thing, we know that there was something going on. We know that life was not normal, right? I mean, we
Right.
know that people were getting sick for whatever reason. They were getting sick.
Well, and there's another interesting aspect to that, which you know for the people who are aware of it, really adds to the whole conspiracy idea, which again, 'cause, I mean, it implies that there's a possibility, but it doesn't necessarily mean that somebody did this on purpose. Are you familiar with Event 201? So in October of 2019, there was a tabletop exercise. Are you familiar with what a tabletop exercise?
Generally, but not specifically.
So for the audience, the idea basically is there were a group of people. In this case, it was public health officials, media, government, industry leaders that got together. Um, and you can look this up online. I mean, I think they've got a YouTube channel and everything. You can actually watch the meeting that it took place. This is not somebody's imagination. It's called Event 201, October of 2019. It was a tabletop exercise, a a thinking of, it's a planning exercise of a scenario that if this were to occur, how would we respond to? So October of 2019, they have this get together, a lot of major people involved, that we're going to role play this idea of how would we respond to a global pandemic of a coronavirus. And you can go back prior to that to what the plans were for response, which, for every other pandemic that we had had, were basically to, we generally reacted as little as possible. Even if you look at, swine flu and bird flu, there was not really much of an official response to that, or, you know, government responses. There was more um, regional or localized responses to that.
Well, there was with the Spanish flu, of course, way back 100 years ago, but that
Yeah,
played
but
out very
that's
similarly to COVID, frankly, with the same people dividing down into different political lines and everything else. Very
Alan.
similarly.
There's potentially more to that story too. So there was one response that we'd had, that we had historically, that Spanish flu was undeniable. I mean, there was large number of people dying and all of that. So they had to do, they had to take some kind of response to that. But like, I was born in 1969, the year of the moon landing and of Woodstock. And I didn't find out until like 2021, 2022. Also in the middle of the Hong Kong flu pandemic,
Mhm.
which my parents didn't know happened. So, you know, completely
Well, it's
different type of
interesting.
thing.
It's interesting you talk about the lack of response to things like the bird flu and Asian flu and things like that. I had a different perspective having been visiting Hong Kong because my wife is from Hong Kong, and visiting her family in Hong Kong, and I saw a lot of response from their governments about it. I mean, to the point where this was years ago, and they were basically watching our body temperatures as we walked off the plane, right? They were
So
literally taking everyone's temperature with heat sensitive cameras.
yeah, so what I had said was it was more local and
Right.
localized and
Yep.
regional. It wasn't a global. When they conducted in Event 201 this idea, I mean, again, this is not necessarily saying there was any maliciousness involved. This was a group of people that would need to address this that got together to come up with a different plan of how we would respond to something like that. And they had, uh, dramatized news reports of like how the media would want to respond. So it was a thing on what we would want to do, and the response that the world took was very much in line with what came out of that meeting. Now, for the conspiracy minded, they would say, well, these people got together and then engineered a pandemic to be able to put this into act. For, those less conspiracy minded, they would say, well, these people were aware of an impending threat. And I mean, the argument could be made that in October of 2019, there were already people aware that there was a potential pandemic coming. 'Cause I don't know, we don't need to get into this now, but I don't know if you're familiar with there was evidence that the initial outbreak had occurred around that time and impacted an Olympics style, like, military athletic competition games type of thing that occurred in Wuhan, and then you had a lot of people who left that with illnesses that, um, they didn't really understand at the time, but in hindsight looked a lot like COVID. So you can make an argument that this was people responding to something that they were already seeing on the horizon, or at the very least, there had long been, it even goes back to, I remember hearing about talk in the Bush, W administration, that they were looking about, there's going to be a pandemic coming. So the idea of people who are going to need to respond to it getting together to plan how they wanted to respond to a pandemic when it occurred is not, that doesn't indicate maliciousness in and of itself.
And by the way, it should be said here that when we're talking about these things, it doesn't necessarily have to be all one way or the other, right? I mean, like for example, we were talking recently about a video that we both watched about a very real event in history where a number of very wealthy bankers and financial people, including um, John D. Rockefeller and those types at the early part of the 20th century, got together on Jekyll Island and basically had a secret meeting that they didn't want anybody to know about, and that what inevitably came out of it was the federal bank, right? The creation of a federal bank. Now, you can very easily say, yes, that was a conspiracy because it was a secret cabal of powerful individuals who had an idea, did something specific for a specific goal, didn't want it to get out and be public, but was it completely nefarious? We don't know necessarily. I mean, they may have in their minds and have very good reasoning behind the idea that this needed to happen. And because it was not popular with the public in a democracy, that it wasn't going to happen if they didn't put some type of conspiracy behind it to make it happen. Right. But they still believe and argued, and they probably would argue this, that they believed it was in the end in everybody's best interest, whether they knew it or not.
And I think this is something that comes in. I feel like it could almost make the argument that what we think of as a conspiracy theory, and I mean, I'm steeped in this and growing up in the 80s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. The James Bond movies and everything, all everything that you watched was, well, there's this group of people and they're trying to take over the world.
Right, exactly, yeah.
What are we gonna do tonight,
Like
brain?
Pinky in the Brain, right?
Yeah. So, and nobody ever gets further than that. It's like once they take over the world, what do they want to
What do
do?
they do? Yeah, right.
Um, but if you look at history, I think an argument could be made that virtually no one has done anything from the perspective of what they think was nefarious. I mean, even your worst example. I mean, Lenin
Yeah, I
was
know. Well,
trying to
that's true. I mean, even with the fascists in World War II, right? I mean, at
Lenin
some
was trying to
level.
make a better country.
Yeah,
Hitler was trying to make a better country. Mao was trying to make a better society.
yep. Yeah, I mean, yeah, and they believed that and by the way, um, the autocrats of today are no different, right? I mean, I think there are people who do believe, who genuinely believe that the world is better off with a small group of powerful people in charge and the minions just toiling away, right? And they believe that that's the proper way for things to be.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't believe that, but I could see making the argument that we've had a system that doesn't seem to be getting anywhere. It's inefficient. There's another video that I'd kind of like to do a whole episode on that talked about building a system that's efficient. Um, but that they've looked at the situation, problems aren't getting solved, we're not getting anywhere. We need to have people that can actually affect change.
Well, that's how we got Trump, frankly.
Yeah. I mean, regardless of what people think about Trump, what they have to remember that I don't think a lot of people acknowledge is that when he says make America great again, he means he really wants to make America
His version of
restore
what he
what
believes is
what
great.
he
Yeah.
believed, he's not trying to be evil. If you believe he's being evil, he's trying to do what he thinks is going to make things better. Now, as with other examples, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to, or it's what we should be doing.
Or that
Um,
it's or that his version of great is actually great.
right. But I mean, he's not Snidely Whiplash twirling the mustache, trying to, tie up maidens on the railroad or blow things up or, it's it's an element I think we lose in a lot of this when we, going back to what you were talking about what I was talking about, with the idea of, identifying an enemy. Part of what we feel like we need to do with that, with the win, that we need to attribute maliciousness to them so we can hold them.
Right. But I mean, in the end, that gets I mean, this is gonna open up a whole new rabbit hole that we don't wanna go down right now, of course, because it's just a whole nother discussion. But, that brings up the question of whether or not intent allows somebody to I mean, can you have the proper intent and still just be evil, right? And just still be wrong, right? I mean, that's a whole nother discussion, of course, but, because then
I
that
don't
gets into whether or not there is an objective reality to morality, right?
I don't think that requires much of a discussion at all. I would say yes.
That it does require intent, is what you're saying,
No, I would say that
or
okay,
that
I'd have
you
to
can be evil. You're saying you can be evil, but still have
you can be evil with
intentional,
by having good intent.
right? Okay, got it. Yeah,
Well, I mean, going back to historical examples, was Hitler evil? Yes. Did he
right.
intend to do good? Yes.
Yes, right. Yeah, gotcha. Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I don't think it's any more complicated than that. We don't, there are other things that we could look at, but I don't, you know,
Well, when it comes to
intending to do good
conspiracies,
doesn't make him good.
right? Exactly. Yeah. But we also know that there are plenty of conspiracies when it comes to, the fascist history and everything as well. But again, that's a whole other discussion. Um, we've only really just scratched the surface with this, right? With conspiracies and the idea behind conspiracies. And I do want to wrap up here, though, with a coming back to the point of understanding when somebody presents to us a belief in a conspiracy, right? Um, it seems to me that the first step in evaluating whether or not we're going to find agreement is in there has to be some level of benefit of the doubt to be given towards intention, right? Because like you said, if you just can just say, "Oh, well, that's he's just a conspiracy crackpot," he's just a conspiracy theorist. Because conspiracy theorist, if you call somebody a conspiracy theorist today, it's generally not a compliment. Would you agree?
Right, and, if if we are looking, because the order that I had in my head, like I had mentioned earlier, was kind of going the next step into looking a little bit more in detail into the history of the CIA, and I feel like this is a good point to interject. The popular narrative, which seems to be the case, is that the pejorative the current understanding of the pejorative term conspiracy theory or conspiracy theorist, they did not originate the phrase, but the popularization of it in our cultural zeitgeist was was done by the CIA in response to people who were saying that the uh, the assassination of John F. Kennedy was something other than what the initial official narrative. So that's a little bit of an oversimplification. You know, it- the way it's said is a little bit of an oversimplification on the point, but people say that conspiracy theory is a term that was popularized by the CIA. So just or at least the idea of using conspiracy theorist as a pejorative term to be able to circumvent discussion on what that person is saying.
Well, that's probably a good place to end it for today. Um, and we're going to have a lot more to talk about on this subject. I'm sure, because it's something that really does highlight a big difference between different perspectives, especially when it comes to politics in America today. Um, and certainly an area of wide disagreement, right? In terms of what is real and what is actual in the world. So it's going to be something that we're not going to be able to avoid.
No, but I hopefully we've at least begun to lay kind of a foundation of when we come to those specific examples that we're going to want to talk about, what analytical process do we
Right.
need to overlay that to begin to make sense out?
Yeah. I mean, this is laying the foundation, as you said, to understanding what it is that we're talking about. And the next step will be trying to find and develop together some tools and a tool set, right, to be able to apply to different topics when it comes to whether or not there's a conspiracy or a theory of a conspiracy at hand in that topic.
Well, absolutely. I think we've almost, definitively stated that our goal here is to help to advance understanding, to create a dictionary so that we know that we're operating from common terms, to establish an analytical framework so we know we're looking at the same things in the same way, so that once it, it's the scientific method. We're isolating all of the different variables. So then, if we get different results, then we can really figure out
Dig in
what
and figure out why we're coming up
why
with
that was and what does that
different
mean.
perspectives. Exactly. Well, thank you, Dean. once again, this is it's always a pleasure to talk to you, and I hope people will subscribe and keep watching, and we'll keep this conversation going.
Absolutely. We'll see you next week.
All right, take care.